First Radio.
Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome to Word First Radio, the podcast brought to you by Word First Ministries. I am your host, Jacob O'Neill, and as always, I'm joined by my friend Cameron.
Hello.
And today, we are joined by the wonderful, the awesome Mr. Julian.
Hi.
Didn't ask your last name.
It's Lysvik.
Lysvik,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay. I used to always do this, like when we first moved here, when I had Norwegian guests on, would ask their first and last name and try and pronounce it and then ask for their feedback.
We've learned better. We've learned not to do that.
Have we learned not to do that? I wanted to do it so bad. Well, Julian, thank you so much for being here. Julian is the senior advisor for Bible translation at the Norwegian Bible Society, and we're going to have him come on here to talk about basically all of my favorite things, regarding Norwegian translation, textual criticism, textual problems and variants, and all fun Bible stuff. So, Julian, thank you so much for coming on.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Why don't you get kicked off real quick and explain to our folks back in California who you are, maybe more in depth than what I shared.
Yeah, good. So I'm quite recently started at the Norwegian Bible Society. Started in August 1st. The reason I'm here, my background is in linguistics. I have a PhD in linguistics from the University of Oslo. I actually took part of my PhD in the US at MIT in Boston. So spent 7 months or so in Boston. Just loved Boston.
Yeah,
it's
so
just
cool.
such an amazing city. MIT was also a fantastic experience. I did my undergrad in linguistics here at the University of Oslo, where I did modern Hebrew, and then later biblical Hebrew, which I took part of that at the University of Jerusalem. So mainly Hebrew and Semitic languages has been my focus, but actually my PhD is in phonetics and phonology, so it's just in the sound patterns of languages.
Yeah.
So a little besides the result, but I used to work in teaching when I taught those who are becoming Norwegian teachers. That's your English teachers, right?
Yeah.
And then suddenly, last August, I had this. It's such a crazy experience. I was on a temporary contract, and it was about to expire, and they told me I would get a new one, but it hadn't happened yet, which means you start looking, right?
Yeah. We promise.
Yeah, exactly. And I was reading, and the Bible Society had just a link that said, apply with us, just send in an application. Like nothing was there, but like just send in an application.
Sure.
And I got this feeling that I had to do that. Yeah. And I had to do it immediately. Such an odd thing.
Yeah.
So I just went downstairs. My daughter was asleep. I spent exactly 1 hour just like collecting my CV and just writing a short and sending it in. An hour later, I get an email back from someone I knew who works here, but also from the General Secretary of the Norwegian Bible Society. Yeah. And they say, our senior advisor for Bible translation, who's had this job for 27 years, is retiring next week.
No way.
And we're looking for a replacement.
Wow.
We urge you to apply for that position.
Oh my gosh.
Which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
And 6 weeks later, I think I got the
Wow.
job. So
That's incredible.
Wow.
pretty amazing.
That is a pretty great origin story. I love that.
It feels like a great origin story.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like a true blessing.
Yeah.
I love that. So what does, just help me out real quick with your role. What does a senior advisor for Bible translation do?
Yeah. So, I mean, in essence, I'm the head of Bible translation, which means that all translation work that we do this is the largest and most popular Bible in Norway is the one that we produce. We do have competitors. Is that I organize all of these, is a lot of the practical stuff. I also have a responsibility for the we call it faglig in Norwegian, so it means kind of like the subject matter.
Okay, yeah.
The languages, the linguistics, all of that. I need to have a good basis of that, but we do have a committee of the biblical scholars, the leading biblical scholars of Norway, as a consulting committee that I also work with. So it's not like I have to know everything by myself. But we do have a lot of different projects running. So currently we have a few minority languages in Norway.
Yeah, okay.
So these are the Sami languages. They're spoken by a native minority. So comparative in many ways, unfortunately, to the native population of the U.S.
Yeah, I was in the Bible Museum recently and learned that the Sami had the Bible in their language before there was a Norwegian translation.
Yeah, that's actually
Really?
true. Yeah.
How'd that happen?
So the reason the reason is
Swede.
because we used to be under Danish rule.
Right.
So the Norwegian Bible, and I'm now making the signs, was a Danish Bible.
Sure.
And by 1895, the first Sami translation was completed, and that was including the Deuterocanon.
Yeah.
Which is also canonical literature, the Old Testament Apocrypha. So that's kind of cool. Yeah. So we have 3 Sami languages spoken in Norway, and we are now this fall actually publishing the first New Testament in Southern Sami. They have not had a translation of the Bible before. So that is really cool.
That is very, very cool.
So I don't know the Sami languages myself, but I work with consultants. I help with, the Hebrew stuff, the Greek stuff when I can. I organize all of these things. We work together with the Swedish Bible Society because the native population is stretched across the Norwegian and Swedish and even the Finnish borders for some of these languages. We're also working on a easy reading translation of the Bible, which is a really cool project that we can talk more about.
Sure.
But you have comparative. I think it's somewhat similar to things like New Living Translation.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Yeah.
But it's less interpretive. So we have a very strict way of doing the easy translation where we're not trying to interpret the text for the readers. This is not for readers who are bad at understanding, right? They're just they just have a lower reading level. So people, lower education, people, young people. This is the target group. So we would try to keep ambiguities. We try to keep the language as close to the original as possible. Just we have ways of making the sentences more accessible. So it's a very strict process, and it's also a complete new translation from Greek. So we're not changing the Norwegian Bible. It's a proper translation. So that's a really cool project. We're also working with sign language community, trying to get a sign language Bible off the ground. Because there's only one in the world, which is American Sign Language.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, Norwegian Sign Language, American Sign Languages are different languages, right? They don't use them.
Completely different.
Yeah, that's right.
Linguistically unrelated. Also in terms of I'm gonna speakers, users of the language. There are far fewer Norwegian Sign Language users, right? I think there's something like 25,000, right, compared to the US, which I'm not sure,
cool.
But
yeah, very cool.
But yeah, that's the role I have.
I love that. Thank you so much for laying that out for us. So the reason why we wanted to have you on today is because we heard it's going around that there's a new revision of the Norwegian Bible coming out, the 2024 revision. Now, as soon as you say the word revision for the Bible or talk about like a new translation, I don't know how it is here, and you could definitely explain that. But I know that where we come from in America, some people like start to get on their heels. They like get really like the mood in the room gets tense. They're like, what's going on? Like a revision of the Bible? Like I thought it was fine the way it was. So what? Maybe you could. Lay out like what exactly is coming out. What is this new 2024 revision of the Norwegian Bible?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are some things that are unique in a Norwegian context. So the Norwegian Bible tradition is very young, very recent, because we used to be under Denmark and we used to have Danish Bibles up until like the late 19th century, actually early 20th century is when we started getting our own Norwegian Bibles, which means that we're still in a place where we need to figure out the language in a sense. So for a brief history, the Bible Society, the first major translation of the Bible Society came out in 1930. And it was the Bible for Norwegians
Right.
for a generation. Because there is an issue that in Norway we have two written languages that are mutually intelligible,
Right.
but used by different parts of the country. We call them Book Norwegian and New Norwegian, which are bad names, but it's what they're called. And the New Norwegian version then came out in 1938. But regardless, in the 1930s, and for 2 generations, this was the only Bible in all practical senses that was used in Norway.
Right.
Then came this idea that we needed to update the language, because eventually the language and the Bible language that was the Norwegian language that was used in 1930 was quite conservative, which meant by the 1960s it was hard to read. It was heavily influenced by Danish and used a lot of Danish words that were gone out of use. Well, in honesty, had never been used in Norway.
Really?
So it was difficult to read, put it mildly. So it was decided we needed a new translation. A new translation came in 1978, which is a long time between those. And that was mostly because we needed a language that was more easily accessible. But it was a completely new translation, and it was very idiomatic, which meant you've probably heard this concordant idiomatic content. So it's either word for word translation or it's like meaning for meaning. And in the 1960s, it's this guy called Eugene Nida, which you might have was like the most inspiring Bible translator, and he's kind of the forefather for a lot of these translations compared to the NIV or the New Living Translation or these texts that are what the idea is, you want to carry the meaning of the text over, not the words. And the 1978 translation was strong in that direction.
Okay.
And that creates reactions, as you probably know.
Sure.
And that's when we started.
What are you talking about?
Because there is an idea in a lot of Christian communities that word by word is somehow more accurate or faithful or true to the original languages, which is an idea I find strange myself, but
how about I can play advocate just a little bit with
go
that,
ahead.
because I actually wrote this down. As soon as I started explaining that to people, they immediately started asking me, well, why can't you just give me word for word what Jesus said in the gospel?
You're changing the words of God.
Isn't that just, why can't you just give me word? If it was good enough for Jesus to say it, why isn't it good enough for me to read it word for word?
It's a fascinating thing, but if you were to translate, first let's say a fiction book from Norwegian into English, and you said, I'm going to translate word for word, everyone would look at you funny, right? Everyone would like, why? I mean, that's not how you do translation.
Yes.
But somehow it is when it comes to the Bible.
Right.
So that would be my first counter. The second one is that it's what happens when you do a translation word for word is that it gets wonky. And it wasn't wonky. What Jesus said when he spoke wasn't wonky to the first listeners. What Paul wrote when he first wrote wasn't odd to the first listeners. So when we translate it in a way that it becomes kind of odd to us, surely we're missing something. Right. And what I'm saying here is that it's a continuum between word for word and meaning for meaning. And all translation falls somewhere on the spectrum, right? It's just a matter of degree. And this spectrum is not a matter of bad or good.
Right.
It's a matter of concordant versus idiomatic. And what's good is that we can do different things. Right. But regardless, there are reactions because people don't always understand this and people don't always agree with it, which is completely fine. And that is when we started getting competitors on the market.
We're going to do a better, more faithful Bible. Well, so in the course of my education, I've taken biblical Hebrew and Greek and even ecclesiastical Latin, and I don't remember very much of any of those things. But even learning that was less useful to my understanding of how equivalent translations of the original text into target language should be than learning Norwegian. As I learn Norwegian, there are ways that we speak in Norwegian that you have to think for a second before you translate them into English. And some of those things are just straight up idioms. So one example might be, there's the English expression to kick the bucket,
Yeah.
which means to die. And you have, so if you're translating from English into Norwegian, where kick the bucket
literally
means it makes no sense.
Yeah.
So do you want to convey the meaning of that, or do you want to maintain the words? And if you maintain the words, you can lose the meaning.
Absolutely.
And then there's an advertisement for one of the grocery stores in Norway, and it said "Spis bedre, leve bedre."
Yeah.
And I was thinking, how would I convey that in English?
Yeah.
So literally, it just means eat better, live better.
Yeah.
But that doesn't say much. There's so much. There seems to be, at least by the time it makes it into English, there's content missing. That's we're missing some words and some grammar to make that make sense.
Yeah.
How do you convey it?
Absolutely. I have a biblical example that I like really like a lot, and that is God's long nose or long nostrils, right? Because it says that God has long nostrils. It's literal phrasing in erech apayim in Hebrew that is used, and it is a metaphor, right, in biblical Hebrew, which means to have slow to anger or slow to wrath is the normal translation of it. There isn't a single translation of the Bible which uses long nostrils.
Right.
Which means, which I think is kind of telling.
Sure.
Right? Because no one expects it. No one does it.
Yeah.
And regardless of how literal you want your translation to be, you don't do that.
Right.
Which shows clearly it is a continuum, right? It's somewhere on the spectrum. You always make some choices. And of course the idiom works really well in biblical Hebrew, because when people are angry, you see hot air coming out of their noses. It says that Jacob was had a hot nose towards Rachel, for example. And the idea here then is that God's nose, right? It takes a long time for the anger to manifest. Right. So slow to anger is a perfect translation. Yeah. Because long-nostriled.
No one knows what that means.
No, exactly.
Unless you speak ancient Hebrew or can read ancient Hebrew.
But so what happens then is you have a translation, and you have some reactions to it. You have people being critical to choices that are made. And it's of course because regardless of how many experts are on a committee for a translation, right, you're going to make some choices that are received differently than you imagined.
Right.
And so this happened in 1978. We had a new Bible translation. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. In 2011,
right,
which was more idiomatic than the previous one. But still, what happens in 2011 is we start getting feedback. This is a good idea. This is a bad idea. And we collected feedback. We collected feedback from academics, from regular preachers, from priests, from ministers, from everyone using the Bible.
Right.
And then in 2019, we said, okay, we're going to sit down, we're going to go through all of the feedback, and we're going to see what's reasonable, what's good, and not. Sure. And then we're going to address some of it.
Gotcha.
And that's what a revision is that people are saying, okay, we this is what you tried to convey, you didn't do that successfully, or there might be better ways of doing this, and we respond by making some changes.
Gotcha.
And that is so okay, we can feel that we're changing the word of God, but it is trying to get closer to the intended meaning for the intended audience.
Sure.
In Norwegian, that is. So I mean, it's comparative, and I guess people have different reactions to this in American as well, in the English-speaking world, but it is comparative to like the NRSV updated edition.
Right.
Yeah.
So then what would be the features that distinguish a revision from an outright new translation?
Yeah. So this is the United Bible Societies, which is all Bible societies in the world are part of it, almost, but with very few exceptions. Yeah. And they have this concept of low-level revision. So they're level 1, 2, and 3. So level 1 is what we've done just now, is a minor update of the language, a few terms that have been changed. Then you have a larger update where you go through whole books or whole texts that are problematic. And then you have something that borders on a translation. And what's happened in Norwegian is that we've never sat down and said, now we're going to make a new translation. We said, we're going to start with a revision, and turns out, it's actually a new translation. So that's the major revision. And the idea from the United Bible Societies is you do that once per generation. So like every 30 years or so, you want to update or completely update the text to a language that is more accessible to the new generation.
Yeah, very, very cool. That's interesting. Like once every generation.
Yeah.
It feels like in America, it's like, well, every publisher with a few dollars wants to make a new translation. That's another thing I was going to point out of like a difference is that you talk about how you do have competitors. There are different Norwegian translations. To take your word for it, I've never heard, not yet at least. I haven't read them myself. I read yours. I read the 2011. So, but in America, there are English translations by, there's so many. And there's so many different ones. So there's paraphrases and then more idiomatic and concordant and things like that.
Every person and their mother has a different translation.
There's so many.
And the first thing you see on an American internet forum is that, like, which Bible translation should I choose?
Which one's the best?
Yeah, exactly. Which was more accurate?
But we do have, I mean, it's, as we say, an embarrassment of riches. We have so many really great English translations.
Definitely.
And so that's something that struck me coming to Norway is we identify the translation by the year that it was put out. And most people couldn't tell you when ESV was published or NIV or even when they've been revised. Because we have so many, we have just this constant stream of really good translations coming to coming to the church. And to hear, well, did you read I don't even remember the years. Did you read 2011 or 2019? What?
That's because the Norwegian Bible Society has been the major player on the market since its inception, and we have given out what is the Bible in Norway. But so you can the two main competitors. One call themselves the Norwegian Bible, Norsk Bibel, and the other calls themselves Bibelen Guds Ord, Bible, the Word of God.
And is that one based on the Textus Receptus?
Yes,
that's the one. Okay.
Yeah, so that one is the one that is inspired by the King James version in ways that we can talk more about.
I thought you were about to say inspired by God.
Well, that too.
I mean,
we'll get to that.
But I've heard that one described as sort of the Norwegian New King James. And that's how I differentiate those things in my mind.
That is probably accurate.
Pretty close.
Yeah,
cool. Yeah, that's typically how I think about it too.
And then here you publish the Bible.
Right.
But I do think if you want to make a comparison, the Bible that we put out, the most recent one, is most comparable to NRSV, probably in terms of the level and how idiomatic it is, how non-idiomatic it is, the type of ideologies that are not ideologies. I don't like that term because people have these odd reactions to it. But in terms of like the principles for how to do the translation, I think the NRSV is probably the closest. That's the to the Norwegian Bible.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I wanted to ask you real quick about the process about revising the text. So. We've already kind of addressed reasons why I don't think people should be uncomfortable with revisions of the text. So we'll talk more about that later. But how are revisions made? Is it like, do you just decide by vote? And that makes people uncomfortable. Does everyone agree on what revisions should be made? Like, does it tell you have a unanimous consensus among your translators that like, yes, this is the canon, translation.
What color are the
revision
cloaks that you wear in the ritual?
Absolutely. No, that is such a good question. We have in Norwegian Bible Society something that I talked about it. The Biblical Scholarly Council. It's called an utvalg. I'm not sure what the best.
I guess.
Gosh.
Yeah, it means a selection, but it's like
the chosen.
Yeah. But it's I think a council is the best. It's a small council and of leading biblical scholars from different backgrounds. So that's also, the Norwegian Bible Society is very ecumenical. So we have Protestants and Catholics and non-denominational on that council, but all with a strong background in Hebrew, Greek, and theology. So basically, they appointed what we call the revision team. And the revision team consisted of 2 biblical scholars and 2 authors. So that is to have a good Norwegian language. And they worked together. They made suggestions, and the council looked at those suggestions and said, we'll do those, we won't do those, we'll prioritize these, usually is what they said. Like, this is what we'll prioritize, this is what we'll wait for a next edition.
Sorry if you already said it, but how big is that council roughly?
So, there are 4 biblical scholars. there are 2 authors. There is me, and there is the general secretary of the Norwegian Bible Society. And then we have the steering board of the Norwegian Bible Society, and they are the last kind of, they have to accept everything. So there's so many levels, and they comprise both.
Well done. Excellent use of comprise.
Corrected myself.
I'm always listening for that. That's pretty good.
They comprise people with both scholarly background and non-scholarly background. So, the user group, the recipient group, and most likely they'll say, yeah, we accept what the advisory board or the council came up with. And sometimes they'll say, no, we don't want this, take it back to the drawing board and come back with a new suggestion. So it is quite an extensive process. The entire thing took almost 4 years, but of course COVID didn't speed things along.
Sure.
Right.
But yeah, that's basically the process. So we look at the suggestions that have been received, and we make a choice how much we have the time to go through.
Sure.
We go we had this major work on coinage and meter and measurement in the Bible. Like complete revision of everything.
Yeah.
And we were like, yeah, we can't actually include this because so a lot of it got into the footnotes.
Well, that's such an interesting question though, right?
Yeah.
So if you're talking about coinage and currency, how much is one? Is it denarii, whatever?
So
So you have some coin, right? So you hear a biblical story, someone tosses another guy a coin, and there's some significance there. And you have to understand what it means. How do you help a modern audience to understand what that means? And even in the light of inflation, because the amount of currency that it is represented changes over time.
So that's how
maybe a whole bunch in one generation.
Definitely. So that's how it got into the Bible, is that for all monetary values, what it says in the footnotes is this equals this many day wages for a worker.
Right.
But we have the background material for that decision is massive.
Yeah, sure.
Because we have a scholar who's really fascinated by coinage. He collects ancient coins.
For 5 words in the footnote.
Exactly.
I love it.
But there's so much work that goes into it.
You have Steve flipped Jeff a coin.
Exactly. And you're like, oh my God.
How does the Norwegian audience in 2024 understand the significance of that?
Exactly.
Should we pay taxes to Caesar? Jesus is like, hand me a coin. No, Jesus.
Not a whole coin.
Whose name is on the credit card?
Okay. Yeah, I imagine those aren't the changes that you get angry emails about, or do you get angry emails?
Those are not the changes we get angry emails about.
That was 3/4 of a day of wage.
Gotcha. Yeah, very, very cool. So with this like decision of or these choices you have to make with like revisions, it seems like you have like several different. Well, there's different layers of people who like approve it and make decisions and things like that. Do you all like? Do you submit do you submit your revision for approval when you like all agree? When most of you agree, or is there any like disagreement, or how does that work?
Yeah, in the council, now I want to call it an advisory board because that makes more sense. Council sounds so
yes,
antique. In the advisory board, we do. It's not like we vote unanimously, but it has to be like a scholarly consensus. That's kind of different, right?
Sure,
because a scholarly consensus just means that I don't like this, but I understand how we can arrive at it, right? So you're allowed to disagree with what's the best choice, but we all agree that it captures the essence of the question.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the level of agreement that we expect, and we haven't had a case where the advisory board itself is in such disagreement that we'd had to take it to a different. I don't know even exactly how we do that. I guess in theory it would fall to me to make that decision, but fortunately we have the board of the Bible Society as the final instance of. But they can disagree, and they have. It doesn't have to be unanimous among them, but it has to be a majority.
Yeah. Really, really cool. Yeah, I think all of this sounds like really, really exciting. And now I'll go to maybe some fun ones for you. And so
those weren't the fun ones.
I'm having fun.
I thought they were the fun ones. They're fun ones to the three of us. But, but some other people like I said at the very beginning, this makes people uncomfortable. It does. I mean, it's especially the way that it is like in our own country. And I know that in Norway, there's been like some like controversies about like some of the revisions being made. We're not going to talk about the specific ones right now. We will later at a later episode. So please stay tuned for that. But maybe just more generally, like, what would you say to someone? Say I was just sitting here and I've been reading the 78 Norwegian translation, right? I've been reading it. That's my Bible. Like I've heard my priests preach out of this. Like this is how I've heard God's voice. I'm sitting here and I say to you, why can't you just keep it the way that it is? Is there something wrong with my translation? Is there something wrong with this? I liked it the way it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the points that I try to make frequently is if you like a previous translation better, use it.
Yeah.
It's not like it's not like it's a bad translation. I don't think any of our translation, I don't even think any of my competitor translations are bad. I mean, use whatever translation you like as long as you read the Bible. I'm more than happy with that. But there is a new generation that has to read the Bible and they have to be able to access it and understand it, and language gets dated. I guess there is certainly disagreement, but sufficient for the day is the evil thereof, says the King James Version.
Yes.
And that's language of the 1600s, right, of the 17th century. I don't understand what that means without knowing what the verse says in Norwegian or Greek even is easier than me.
Most English speakers would not understand what that means either.
That's what I mean. So the language needs to be updated because it has to be accessible to people. And I think the amount of people that would sit down and kind of, grind through 17th century English, to take that example, in order to understand the message, are very few.
Well, I imagine there's also a sense in which you're sort of translating that 17th century English into contemporary English in your own mind.
I mean, I'm gonna, the language of people misunderstand the language of the 17th century because they think they know what it means, but they don't. Sure. And this is odd one. Like if I say that, people getting uncomfortable. The Church of Latter-day Saints has had this issue with and that's that's 19th century, right? With the Book of Mormon, with words in English that meant something different in the early 19th century than it does today. And if I say that about the Church of Latter-day Saints, people say, "Yeah, of course." But if I say that about our translation, oh no,
exactly. So ours wasn't written down by a human.
Exactly. And I don't mean that as a detriment again to the King James Version or to the Church of Latter-day Saints, but I mean that as a point of why we need to keep the language updated.
And imagine we took a modern translation and gave it to somebody in 1611.
Yes,
and to try and understand this, right? And they'd have exactly the same problem.
Absolutely,
have words whose meaning is totally different now. Or I've heard them sometimes called false friends. So you think you understand the meaning of this word, but you don't, and it changes your understanding of the text in a negative way.
Yes.
You now misunderstand the text because you misunderstand the language. And happening in real time, I can see how we don't perceive significant changes in the way that language works personally. So I guess I'm half answering your question, Jacob, when you're like, I have my 1978 Bible. It's good for me. It was good. It was good for the church. What's wrong with it? Well, you haven't perceived the way that language has changed over your lifetime, and you're still native, or close enough native to sort of the 1978 version of the language. And so I remember I have an experience of like, you can read letters that soldiers sent back home during the American Civil War. That wasn't that long ago. And so it's not unreadable.
No.
But it's almost unreadable. Well, maybe it is because they wrote it in cursive, and Americans can't handle that anymore. But even the words, you go, okay, I have to strain to understand this language, and that's way more contemporary than.
There's a fun example of that in because the Denmark are doing a new Bible translation currently as well, due to finish in 2036.
Oh goodness!
Wow.
13 years. That's the average amount of time it takes for a Bible translation. It's 10 to
good, and then
12 years.
Then they're halfway toward the next.
Exactly. The next version. So it means I'm not out of a job soon.
Good.
But they have a fun example of that, which is the word, both Norwegian and Danish, spotte, which means to make fun of. Yeah. But the problem is that in Danish, that word isn't really in use anymore. But what they have is that they borrowed the English word to spot. something, which means to notice, right?
Yeah.
So they can't use that word anymore because when people read that someone was spotting Jesus, what they hear is that they saw him and pointed to him, right? Yeah. But what it means is they were making fun of him, right? So that's one example of these false friends, and we have to be aware of them. Yeah,
right. Yeah, I mean, I love that kind of stuff. I remember that there was a many years ago. I did not watch this when it came out because it was a little before my time. But have you ever heard of John Ankerberg?
No.
Okay. I love John Ankerberg.
Yeah, John Ankerberg. He's an American Christian broadcaster. He would always do these TV programs in the 90s and early 2000s on Christian issues, all Christian issues. And they had one episode on King James onlyism and talking about this. And oh my gosh, that's it's like a crash course in textual criticism. If you wanted to get a general outline of what it is, there it is.
I'm certain you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah. I've watched it on YouTube
John
many
Ankerberg
times.
show. It's so good.
Dan Wallace was on Dr. Dan Wallace was on that panel, and of course not on the King James onlyist side, but he was saying that listen, the point we're trying to make is that translations need to change so that we can maintain the faith because people need to understand the Word of God. And he pointed out to that older translations, because of the changing of, in America, English words, the older translations, the King James is changing a lot faster than their Bible, than the new Bibles are, than the New American Standard, the New International Version, the NLT.
Yeah.
The old Bibles are changing much faster than the new ones.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I mean, I just love all of that.
I mean, even the Catholic Church with a Latin translation had an update of the Latin translation, right? The language no longer spoken as an everyday language, which shows the necessity, like the new Vulgate, right?
They recently updated the Vulgate?
Yeah.
I
mean, recently. It's
not
recently.
Since people stopped speaking Latin.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When was that update done?
Oh, yeah.
Do we know?
Now you're putting me on the spot.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I should know.
If you can get within 400 years, we'll be safe.
Yeah. I think, We'll check it up.
We'll look it up and we'll insert it here. And we'll use
I only know that because I have a new Vulgate at home, and I was kind of disappointed it wasn't the Jerome translation.
You should just say, I know it was, and we'll edit in my voice with the year and the date. Yeah, but I mean, that's actually a really good point that I can just talk about for a little bit. I mean, it seems like anybody, it doesn't matter who has ever revised or made a new translation has always gotten the same criticism. You know, I could imagine people in 1611, right, saying to the King James translators, "What about the Vulgate? What's wrong with the?"
There's the Geneva Bible,
and the Geneva Bible, and the Bishop's Bible.
I mean, the King James Version is a revision of the Geneva Bible.
Right.
And it was the liberal revision of the Geneva Bible.
And the languages, and it was heavily criticized. One of the reasons criticized is because the language that they used was archaic already then, right? The English. So, and Jerome was criticized in the 400s for his Latin translation of the Bible for similar things. Absolutely, this is
I mean, so if we're talking about historical pedigree, right? I mean, the Latin Vulgate. How long did the church use the Vulgate? Over 1,000 years, something like that. They used it forever. And so when people want to bring this argument of this is the way we've been, we've read the Bible and have understood the Bible. It was fine for us then. Why isn't it fine for us now? That's the thing that everyone who has ever revised or translated the Bible again has heard from someone. John Ankerberg made that point on his show. I think he's just right. That's what the King James people are saying now. I'm sure that's what you guys are hearing. Those are the
the amount of emails I've gotten that greet me with the final words of Revelation.
I'm not adding to the
I understand you shouldn't add to. By the way, Revelation, when it says that, is talking about the book of Revelation. Right. It's not talking about the Bible. But secondly, how am I supposed to translate it if I can't add or take away?
If the original says spis bedre, leve bedre, how do I convey the meaning of that without adding a couple of things?
Let's close with that. I'll just this will be as pointed as I'll ask this.
Sure.
Aren't you changing the Word of God?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are.
Okay.
In a sense, in the sense that we're trying to make it accessible to new people, to people who haven't had access to it before, who aren't familiar with older with older biblical language, right? So we're changing it in the sense that we're changing the target language, but with a goal of getting as close to the source language as possible. So yeah, changing, but in a good way. Yeah. I think that's how I view it.
Sure.
And I guess, but I think it's important to keep that in mind because we are translating.
Right.
And translation always involves choices. It involved choices for the people translating the Geneva Bible, the King James Version. It involved choices for the people translating the Septuagint before the time of Christ, right?
Right.
You are losing something in a translation. You are gaining something. That's how it is.
Well, and maybe, not to be too controversial, but even... so we could say in theory, but possibly the men who wrote down scripture who are quoting Jesus in a different language than he was speaking when they heard it. Are they changing the word of God?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And in one sense, I mean, yeah.
A translation is at the heart of Christianity. The Bible that the New Testament writers used was a translation.
Right.
The language we have isn't Aramaic, right? It's Greek, which isn't the language Jesus spoke. So yeah, this is the heart of our belief. And I think if we think differently, then we're wrong. To be very strong about it. And it's part of why Christianity, as I understand it, is still so important today.
Yeah. And what's, oh gosh.
Yeah.
Sorry, I hadn't thought of it in these terms before, but when Peter is speaking to the crowd and suddenly they hear his words in their own languages.
Oh yeah.
Like what a like one of the most powerful first act of the Holy Spirit upon the church was that of translation and making universal what was once limited to a certain number of people.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I love it. That's a great sentiment to end on. Thank you so much for your thoughts in this episode. For you listening at home, we've got way more coming your way, and I hope you're excited about it as much as I am. I don't know if that's possible, but please be excited for it because we've got more great stuff coming with Dr. Julian here. Thank you so much for this first episode, sir. And you listening, we'll see you again next week. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Word First Radio. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check us out online at wordfirst.us.